Let's cross live now to Daniel Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University. Daniel, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Now, what do you make of this latest plan by the US government to reassert domination over Latin America?
It wouldn't be a reassertion, it would be an ongoing continuation of the same geopolitical domination that the United States has tried to sustain since the 1824 Monroe Doctrine. General Laura Richardson's tone before the House of Representatives is particularly hawkish. Usually the U.S. tries to hide behind more humanitarian motives, but she's come out very blatantly and said that really only the U.S. has the right to exploit South America. Imagine the hypocrisy of saying that China or Russia is on the quote-unquote 20-yard line of the U.S. homeland when the U.S. military has Russia encircled with NATO and, of course, all of their aggression using Taiwan to try to trigger a proxy war against China. So what we really hear out of the mouth of Laura Richardson is the same old hypocrisy and double standards that we've heard from U.S. imperialism now for centuries.
Mm-hmm. What do you think Russia and Chinese influence in Latin America is really that much of a threat to the U.S.? And what do you think that Russia and China can offer Southern America that America can't at the moment?
And that's precisely what the U.S. is afraid of, that there are now different trading poles. There are different geopolitical camps that the countries of South America can use. I recently returned from Cuba, and the Cubans constantly reiterated, if it wasn't for Russian solidarity, if it wasn't for millions of tons of grain that the Russians sent to Cuba, where would Cuba be today, where there's already hunger sparked by the blockade, but what the U.S. wants really is extreme hunger and starvation. That's what the blockade against Cuba has always signified. And their open aggression against the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, their aggression against the MAS leadership in Bolivia, and of course Nicaragua. Nicaragua, really a country that has been striving economically despite the increased U.S. sanctions. Always, every week, we hear about heightened sanctions against those four countries that I mentioned. And the fact that there exists a Russian camp and a Chinese camp and an Iranian camp means that these sanctions every day are less and less effective at meeting Washington's objective, which is total isolation of any anti-capitalist country.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did actually mention Cuba there, and obviously that brings to mind the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think that some Latin American nations could perhaps be wary of getting too close to Russia, given some of these historical events in the past that have brought these nations at loggerheads?
We should remember that it wasn't just a Cuba missile crisis, it was a Turkey missile crisis, because the U.S. had nuclear weapons very close to the Soviet Union in 1962 and throughout the entire Cold War, which was a global class struggle for power. I think each South American government is orienting differently. We still have neoliberalism in command, in the driver's seat of Ecuador, of Guatemala, of other countries. Right now, Brazil's trying to have a more neutral stance. We saw the coup in Peru. We have a huge election coming up in Argentina in October. So we have this showdown in all of these different countries between the forces of multilateralism, of a whole new day, and the forces that continue to be lackeys of U.S. imperialism.
What's your assessment, excuse me, of the prospects for these Latin American nations to break free from the U.S. sphere of influence, or do you think they're destined to stay there forever?
No. It's a whole new day. If we look at Brazil prior to Lula taking power in 2003, Brazil economically and geopolitically was squarely in the pocket of U.S. neocolonial interests. Today, there's a different reality. Today, if we look at trade, whether it's in Uruguay or El Salvador or Brazil, we see that China is often the leading trading partner. And the U.S. has had this pretentious attitude of backyardism against South America and the Caribbean for so long. So they're very alarmed that there are now options, actual democratic options, and even the more right-leaning governments, like the Ecuadorian government, for example, they don't want to be left behind. So even the neoliberal regimes are reaching out to China, Russia, and other trading partners. So it's a whole new day. We can no longer talk about when there'll be a rise of multipolarity, because we're living right now second to second, day to day, year to year, through the collapse of U.S. hegemony and the rise of multilateral interests, specifically in the South American continent, with voices like Evo Morales and Rafael Correa and so many others who are pushing this anti-imperialist agenda.
Indeed, some tectonic shifts in global geopolitics.